This week, I would like to talk to you about the final Mercury-Pluto conjunction in the zodiac sign of Capricorn that will be taking place on February 10th, at least for us, because Mercury will not conjoin Pluto in the zodiac sign of Capricorn for another 248 years. Many times we think, oh, this should be an enormous event. Let's see what's going to happen. I wonder if such and such a thing will materialize. That's not the way that this conjunction is going to work.
This podcast episode is sponsored by Astrology Hub's Academy. Wherever you are on your astrology journey, we have a class that will help you get to the next level.
Hello, my name is Christopher Renstrom, and I'm your weekly horoscope columnist here on Astrology Hub. This conjunction between Mercury and Pluto, a conjunction that's been happening repeatedly, at least for once a year since the year 2009, this is a conjunction that we've all gotten used to, this conjunction of Mercury and Pluto, and so it's something that's unfolded into our horoscopes, it's unfolded into our lives since the year 2009. So this conjunction isn't going to bring a dramatic event or an extraordinary revelation. In fact, this conjunction might very well have gone on sight unseen. It's not really one of those great, astonishing planetary configurations that take place in the sky. However, for me, as an astrologer, I think it's a very important conjunction, and it's a very profound one. So let me break it down for you. Pluto was named after the Roman god of the underworld, the third of the three modern planets, the one that was discovered in 1930, so it's the one that's really the most recent addition to the astrological pantheon, Pluto. Pluto was named after the Roman god of the underworld, and so his Greek counterpart was Hades, and being the Roman god of the underworld, his kingdom was the kingdom of the dead. He basically ruled over all departed souls. And Pluto hence gets its reputation for being associated with the underworld, with death. This is where it comes from. But the underworld was also understood as a place where we mine gold and silver and precious metals, diamonds, oil comes from the underworld. It comes from underneath the ground. It comes from inside the earth. And so all of those things are also associated to the planet Pluto. In fact, our idea of wealth, we have a term for it, for what we call people who are extremely wealthy, the elite, the billionaires of the world. We refer to them as the plutocracy, because Pluto means wealth. That's where it comes from. So plutocracy literally means the moneyed class or the wealthy class. So these are the things that Pluto is associated with. Pluto is also a planet of expiration dates. It's the planet that tells us your time is up. Okay, things have come to an end. Again, we associate that more with our mortality or death and dying, but expiration dates are things that we have on all sorts of packages on our refrigerator. A deadline. Think about that deadline. Okay, this is when it's supposed to be done. This is when it's wrapped up. This is when it's finished. This is when you turn it in. This is all associated to the planet Pluto in astrology. So how I would advise you to work with the energy of this Mercury and Pluto conjunction in Capricorn that's taking place with February 10th. Message to you for this week isn't that it's a prediction, but actually an exercise. It's a way to work with this particular planetary conjunction. And how I would advise you to work with this conjunction is almost to treat it as if you were going to your refrigerator and cleaning it out, looking for all the things in the back of the refrigerator that have reached their expiration date, or they have mold, or it's been a little while. Things that should be tossed out, things that should be thrown into the garbage. I want you to almost look at your own psyche as your own personal refrigerator, and for you to go through this psychic refrigerator, your own personal psychic refrigerator, beginning on February 10th, and to start looking at the objects that are in it and determining, what has really overstayed its welcome. It's no longer good. It's gone rotten. It's got mold. I can't even believe it's in here anymore. And to get rid of it. Now, this isn't some sort of purging of your psychological apparatus that I'm talking about. I'm not saying that you need to go do some shadow work with great force and focus and rout out all those, awful parts of yourself, that negative self-thinking, and replace it with more positive or constructive mantras. No, this is not what I'm suggesting at all. I'm actually suggesting a kinder approach, a gentler approach, and more importantly, a reflective approach to different parts of your psyche that have perhaps overstayed their welcome, or you don't need them like you once needed them before. Now, what are these different parts of the psyche that I'm talking about? Is it bad habits or personal indulgences? No. What I'm talking about are defense mechanisms. Defense mechanisms inside of you that no longer serve an active purpose. Now, defense mechanisms are a good thing, okay? Defense mechanisms are patterns of behavior that we enlist in service to defend and to protect our psyche, okay? So many of the defense mechanisms that we use in our lives are good things. They might not be the best. They might not be particularly or empowering, but they are defense mechanisms, and their job is to protect, okay? And it's to protect the psyche, and it does it in a number of different ways. I'm talking about defense mechanisms that are no longer actively, or should I say, consciously employed. Defense mechanisms that perhaps are no longer necessary. Yes, there is such a thing. Think of it as the way that your computer does backup files, and it keeps doing backup file after backup file after file repetitively. You don't need all of those backup files. Maybe perhaps you need the latest backup file or something like that. But there's all sorts of systems that run in the background in a computer that accumulate information. It's referred to as the ghost in the machine. It accumulates information and keeps this information and sort of like takes up room in the computer, takes up room in the hard drive, and it's not really all that useful. These are the sorts of defense mechanisms that I'm talking to you about. So how do we identify them? What are they about? What is Christopher talking about? I want to tell you a little story. I want to give you a couple of examples. And the example that came to mind when I was reflecting on this week's talk with y'all is this idea of Mercury. Mercury, we know, is the planet of communication. It's the planet of messages, all those sorts of things. But Mercury is also the planet of the mind. It's the planet of the way that we think, all right? And so the way that we think is described by Mercury, and Mercury can be in one of 12 signs of the zodiac. So that means there are 12 different ways to describe the way that we think. So in looking at this week's example of a Mercury-Pluto conjunction in Capricorn, what I wanted to take on was the idea of Mercury in Capricorn, the Capricorn mindset, and how it would be connected to the planet of Pluto. And what came to mind when I was thinking of defense mechanisms and Capricorn and Pluto and things that perhaps might have overstayed their welcome or outlived their usefulness, what came to mind were stories that I remember hearing about in the 1970s. And these stories were about Japanese soldiers who had been stationed on different islands in the Pacific who had not heard in 1945. They didn't know in 1945, or didn't believe, rather, in 1945, that the war was over. Okay. They believed very much that the war that Japan was fighting in the Pacific theater was still going on, and they were manning their posts, and they were not going to give up these posts no matter what. And so this was sort of thing that some soldiers would come in over the years, in the later 40s or 50s and things like this, because Japan did an active campaign, as did the Allied forces, of getting the word out that the war was over and things like that. But there were these holdouts. There were Japanese soldiers who stayed on these islands for decades after the war had ended. There were 3 of them that I remember. The first one was Shoichi Yokoi, who was rediscovered on Guam in the year 1972. He was an ex-tailor and a conscript, meaning that he had been drafted into the Japanese army, and he was a sergeant. And Sergeant Yokoi was perfectly aware, by the way, that the war had ended, at least by the year 1952, according to his own admission. But the reason that he didn't give himself up is because of his army's Bushido code. And that code was a code that you enjoin, you participate in self-sacrifice. You even would commit suicide or give up your life. And this would be an honor to Japan. But what you are not to do is opt for self-preservation. And so that he was afraid that because he had been stationed on this island and didn't find out about the end of the war later, he was afraid that if he turned himself in, that he would be considered a deserter and that he would be summarily court-martialed and then executed. So his fear, all right, and I want you to think about this as we go forward into what we're talking about today, his fear that he would be court-martialed and executed, his fear of that happening made him not want to turn himself in. And so he lived for decades in a hole in the ground where he lived off the land and fish and ate insects and things like this, and basically lived like a wild man in the jungle. He was that afraid that he would be executed if he turned himself in, that he had not given his life for his country, as was proof of him still being alive, and that he would be executed. And it was that fear. I want you to hear the Capricorn here. It was that fear that kept him hidden and resisting turning himself in. There was another fellow, he's actually much more famous of the 3, and his name was Hiru Onoda. And Hiru Onoda was very different from Yokoi. He was an elite officer. He was an intelligence officer in the Japanese army in World War II. And he had been given strict orders by his commander, and a group of men had been given strict orders by the commander when Japan was falling to march into the jungle as far as you could go and to remain hidden. But unlike Yokoi, who hid himself in a hole out of fear, they were to remain hidden and then do guerrilla maneuvers to take out or kill different people. And they were to do this until they were given orders by the commanding officer to desist. And this is exactly what Onoda and his fellow compatriots did. And they did this for a number of years, and I think they succeeded in maybe killing 30 Filipinos. This was on the island of Lubang. They succeeded in killing 30 Lubang islanders and wounded about 100 more in a sporadic guerrilla campaign that was fought since 1945, ongoing into the 50s, even the 60s. So what happened is that in 1974, it was down to Onoda and one other officer who had finally been killed. And so Onoda was completely on his own. Now, this wasn't a Caspar Hauser story where they're locked up in the basement and they didn't know that World War I had happened and they stumble on the street and meet other people who say you didn't know. No, this wasn't this at all. Onoda knew full well that things had moved forward. There were airplanes that were flying over him, and for a number of years they would drop leaflets. But when they dropped these leaflets, he and his compatriots were convinced that it was American propaganda, that it was a trick, that it was to fool them. And these leaflets would have letters from loved ones or Japanese people saying, surrender, the war is over, whatever, and they refused to believe it. they absolutely refused to believe it. So in the case of the first fellow, where it was fear, in the case of Onoda, it was a refusal to believe. Not necessarily that the war was over, but that perhaps they might have lost the war, but they still had this mission, which was to conduct guerrilla warfare, and he was going to do exactly that. So in his case, it's to continue to fight, because those were the last orders he had been given, to go into the jungle and conduct this guerrilla warfare. So if you think of our defense mechanisms, we can have defense mechanisms that perpetrate themselves. They continue themselves out of fear, okay? Fear that if they yield the field that they will be destroyed. And so we can have in our psyche defense mechanisms that do this. We can also have in our psyche defense mechanisms that refuse to be convinced otherwise. They've been given orders. They've been given orders by our psyche to protect and to maybe even maintain guerrilla warfare, to serve the interests of the psyche. And so it doesn't matter how much information our defense mechanisms get to give up the war, that things have changed or something like that, they will persist. They will persist because these are the orders that have been given. And this was very much the story of Onoda. Onoda eventually was greeted by a 24-year-old Japanese kid in 1874 named Norio Suzuki. Norio Suzuki had heard of Onoda, and Norio Suzuki was a bit of an eccentric himself. He had had a kind of like little bucket list, things he was going to do, that he wanted to do, great searches that he was going to conduct. The first item on his list was to find Onoda. He had heard about him. The second item on his list was to find a lost herd of pandas. And the third one was to find the abominable snowman. So Onoda being the first item on his list, this rumor that there was an elite Japanese soldier that was somewhere in the jungles of Lubang, he went on out to find him and did. Actually, Onoda found the kid first and was about to shoot him as the kid was calling out to him in Japanese. But he noticed that the kid was wearing thick woolen socks tucked inside sandals, and he knew that there was no way that a Filipino was going to dress like that. So he trusted that it was a Japanese kid, and he came out and introduced himself. And so he returned hesitantly, and indeed, it was only when his commanding officer was contacted by the Japanese embassy to come to the island to tell Onoda, to tell him to surrender. His commanding officer at this time, I think, was a bookseller in Japan. So he came to the island to tell Onoda to surrender. And that's finally when Onoda did surrender. And then President Marcos at that time gave him a full pardon. So we have how our defense mechanisms can continue on under the radar of our conscious mind out of fear of being discovered or found. We can see how our defense mechanisms can continue without our knowing or our approval, because they've been given a mission by our psyche. The mission that they've been given by our psyche is to protect and to defend. With the third story is the story of Teru Nakamura, who was the last of the forgotten soldiers, Japanese soldiers, to surrender himself. In 1974, rumors had reached the Japanese embassy in Jakarta that there was a soldier hiding out in the jungle, and 11 soldiers were dispatched into the jungle to retrieve him. Now, I think he had been spotted from the air several times, but reaching him where he had stationed himself was so remote that it was like a 3-day climb and travel through treacherous mountain terrain and jungles. They did reach him. They figured out he was somewhere in this jungle area. And what they did is that they had memorized the words of the Japanese national anthem from the 40s, which they sang aloud to Nakamura. And they also held up pictures of geishas. Okay, I guess it was here are women and you haven't seen a woman in a long time, so come look at this beautiful woman. Anyway, Mira could have cared less. He was terrified. He was half starved. He was very frightened, and he came out very sheepishly, and they greeted him, but like Yokoi, he had to be convinced, and it took them a number of days, that if he went with them, that he would not be executed. And eventually they did prevail, and eventually they brought him back to Japan, where he was indeed repatriated. When asked at the time by one journalist how he felt about wasting 3 decades of his life on Morotai, which was the island he was on, he angrily replied that the years had not been wasted and that he had been serving his country. Okay, so there's also, when we approach these defense mechanisms in our own psyche, these defense mechanisms that have been stationed in outposts to defend who we are, when we approach these defense mechanisms, we can't just turn them off like a remote or a computer or a light switch or something like that. We have to approach them with reassurance because they've been fighting the good fight as far as they are concerned, these defense mechanisms of ours. They've been fighting the good fight. And so we must approach them with reassurance. And then we also must approach them with respect. These aspects of ourselves have taken great pride in protecting. Think about it. If there's a defense mechanism that is retaliatory within you, it always fights back. There's great pride in doing that. It's believed that was the only way to defend and protect you. Okay, so we have to be reassuring in the way that we these aspects of ourselves that we don't need them in the way that we needed them before. We need to be reassuring. We need to be respectful. They've given up years of their lives to protect us. And then we need to repatriate in some way. We need to redirect or reassign. Like the Furies at the end of the Oresteia, if you're familiar with the Oresteia, where they have the trial of Orestes. And the Furies are like the anger and the vengeance spirits of Clytemnestra. Clytemnestra is the mother of Orestes. Orestes has killed her because she killed her husband Agamemnon, who's also Orestes' father. So Orestes is given this mission to avenge his father, but the only way he can avenge his father is to murder his mother, which is as bad, if not worse, a crime. And the moment that she is murdered by Orestes, from her blood spring the Furies, which are these spirits the spirits of the murdered, of the spirits of people who have been murdered or slain without justification. And so it's vengeance. And so they haunt the mind. They haunt the mind of Orestes, and he stands trial. And at the end of the trial, when Orestes is acquitted by Athena, Athena also makes a point of reassigning the Furies. The Furies are like, you've robbed us of this. How can you deny us vengeance? This boy killed his mother. How could you? And so she gives this argument to the Furies, and then she reassigns them as protecting spirits of Athens. Okay, so they go from haunting and running down the guilty murderers to becoming spirits of protection and benevolence. In fact, they're renamed the kindly ones at the end of the play. And in a way, we need to do that with our defense mechanisms. Okay, they've served us well. They've done the time in the trenches. They followed orders. And now we're saying the war's over, or the need for you is done. And so we need to assure them, we need to convince them, and we need to find new places in our psyche for them, not just unplug them. What are these defense mechanisms, okay, that we're talking about? What are these modes, behavior modes that are trying to protect us, that believe that the job that they're doing is right? Okay, they come in different guises, but the guises that I really wanted to explore with you and for you to think about in the privacy of your own home. These guises come from a passage that was written by Abu Ma'ashar, who was an astrologer, and he gives a very lengthy description of Saturn. It's much more lengthy than I could go into here, but there are certain qualities, there are certain characteristics that are assigned to Saturn, which of course is the ruling planet of Capricorn. And I chose the ones that sounded very Capricornian to me. So remember, why am I citing these things? Reflect and see if they resonate or make any sense to you, because what I'm intoning here is Mercury, which is the planet of the way that we think, okay, in the zodiac sign of Capricorn, so that describes the temperament, okay, and then Pluto, things that are underground, things that are hidden. Pluto could be the avenging spirit of the Furies. Pluto could be the soldiers protecting. You know, what Pluto and Capricorn also does here is protect and defend. Pluto talks about that innermost part of ourselves that will struggle to survive no matter what. We ourselves might be like, oh, I want to give in, or I can't do it, or I'm very ill. Why can't I just die? Pluto is that energy in the body that still keeps going on, no matter what, no matter how much health deteriorates or pain is being suffered. Pluto insists on surviving and going on. It's that embedded in the astrological chart. So I wanted you to think of these psychological defense mechanisms. And the first one that came to mind, thinking of Capricorn, of course, and Pluto in Capricorn, is money. Now, one might be like, how can money be a defense mechanism? An obsession with money or focus on money can be a defense mechanism. Okay, what is it defending? It's defending being disenfranchised. It's defending being ripped off. It's defending having been given the short end of the stick. So it's more than a grievance, okay? It's more than I was robbed and I'm going to be angry about it. This is like a focus on money, on making sure that it never happens to you again. Maybe you went through some sort of financial disgrace. Maybe your family went through some financial disgrace, some very difficult time. This kind of like Scarlett O'Hara vow before the intermission of Gone with the Wind, where she says with the burnt plantation, I will never go hungry again. Okay, this can become a defense mechanism imbued in the psyche. I will never go hungry again. I will never be at the bottom of the wheel again. Okay. And so this can turn into an obsession or a drive with money. Okay. That's there to defend. It's there to protect. It's there to ensure you will never go hungry again. And so what I want you to ask about or to reflect upon, was there an earlier place in your life, event in your life? Was there something that happened historically in your family that started off this obsession with money, this obsession with I will never go hungry again? And is it still relevant? Do you still need it? Does it still need to rule over your life? Does it still need to color all of your financial decisions? The other thing that I want you to think about is bitterness. Bitterness of challenging circumstances that might have robbed you of something. Maybe there were challenging circumstances in your teens or early adult life in which you had these dreams, these aspirations, these ambitions. You were going to be the best person at sports or art or hit single that was going to go platinum, or film career, something like this. And you got a bad turn, and that didn't happen. Circumstances went against you. Maybe heavy responsibilities were put on you, or you weren't regarded as being talented enough, or you didn't see the right people who would recognize what you could do or knew how to work with you. Maybe you were ahead of your time in some sort of way, writing lyrics that nowadays would sell millions. And so a bitterness can come on in. Now, a lot of people think bitterness is just a feeling, but bitterness can be a defense mechanism, all right, because it hides the heart. If you remember Sleeping Beauty, when she pricks her finger on the spindle and she falls asleep, there's this forest of roses that grow up around the castle so that it's surrounded by these heavy branches, these trees of thorns. It's very foreboding and forbidden, and no one goes near this castle where it's rumored that this entire royal family and court has fallen asleep. No one can penetrate this thorny barrier. And so this is what bitterness can do when it wraps around the heart or the soul. It becomes a defense. It fills you perhaps with cynicism or sarcasm, and it's there to defend you from ever being vulnerable or open, or defend you from ever being aspiring or dreaming again. So that can be a defense mechanism. Another defense, and it's a trait that Abu Ma'ashar goes on about in regards to Saturn and Capricorn, is coveting. Okay, coveting what someone else has. That person, I want what that person has. And it's not that marvelous scene with Meg Ryan where, she basically shows Billy Crystal how women fake orgasms and someone eating at another table says, I'll have what she's having. It's not that. But it's, I covet someone's fame. I covet their spouse. I covet their children. I covet their way of life. And that covetousness can be a defense mechanism because it draws the attention away from your feeling of want and never having. And the thing is, we can feel very vulnerable when we want something. We can feel very vulnerable when we need something. And so a defense mechanism can redirect that behavior. It can turn it into, I covet what that person has, and then you focus on that person with great hostility. That person becomes an enemy or a menace or someone who took something away from you or doesn't deserve it. And that kind of focus diverts the attention, and it diverts the attention from the fact of wanting or needing something and the pain of not having gotten it. Okay, so coveting can become a form of a defense mechanism. The other defense mechanism associated with Capricorn is guilt. That's an interesting one. For this one, I turn to Elaine Pagels. I don't know if any of you are familiar with her. She is most famous for having written the Gnostic Gospels and Gospel according to Thomas. And she's an extraordinary scholar whose background is in Judaism, Christianity, and Buddhism. And if you ever get a chance to read Gnostic Gospels, or particularly the Gospel according to Thomas, highly recommend it. It's beautiful. But in a book that she wrote called Why Religion, she writes about guilt, okay? And I first heard this story from her in an interview that she was doing, and she told this story. She told this story about how she had a child who died when he was 6, and he had already had a very difficult birth and difficult infancy, and then it was also diagnosed that he had this particular disease or failure or whatever, physical ailment, that he wasn't going to live very long. So she lived continually knowing that he was going to die, and that itself was a test. But she put all of this love, and she loves him. It's her baby, and she's going to enjoy and celebrate his life as long as he is alive. And they were very close, her husband and she and her child. But her child dies at the age of 6, and then a year later, her husband dies in a mountaineering accident. And so Moyers was talking to her about what could you turn to? What could possibly give you spiritual comfort? Did you find spiritual comfort at this time? You lose your child who you know is going to die young, but a year after that, you lose your husband. Where were you? Not where were you in terms of presence, but where were you in your heart? Where were you in your soul? What was going through your mind, your heart, and soul? That's really what I want to say. What was going through your mind, your heart, and soul? And what she said is that what impressed her so powerfully was the feeling of guilt, that she felt so guilty about her child dying. And this is before her husband had passed. And so this prevalent feeling of guilt, and she did a lot of reflection on where that guilt was coming from. She's not causing her child to die. She's suffering the greatest tragedy of her life. Where's this guilt coming from? And people would say, don't feel guilty or whatever, but she did. And so where is it coming from? And she says that there was a certain point in her son's medical treatment in which she realized that guilt was only masking something that was so much more deeper and so much more painful. So the guilt itself was a mask. It was a veneer. It was protecting something that was so much deeper and more painful. She realized as long as she could blame herself, feel guilty, as long as she could blame herself, was it her body that had given this to her son? Had she done something wrong? Was she not a good enough mother? As long as she could blame herself, as long as she could put the guilt on herself, she didn't have to encounter or recognize the more painful thing. And the more painful thing that she described is helplessness. Guilt at least gave her some kind of control over her body, over her life, over her son. It centered it back in her. But that guilt was a veneer, a defense mechanism. And what it protected in her was this feeling of utter helplessness. That was the thing that she needed protection from. And it was by working through the guilt and coming to an acceptance of that. I don't know. I can't speak for Elaine Pagels, but I would imagine was at least some kind of spiritual journey of self-discovery down into herself. Maybe it brought relief or release or a sort of self-forgiveness. I don't know. I can't speak for her, but I know that in what she imparts, it was a realization that the guilt was a defense mechanism and what it was protecting was an utter helplessness. And so I offer that to you. Has guilt outlived its purpose in your life of protecting you from a helplessness, or is it still going through the rounds? Does it protect you from helplessness, from despair, from grief? Is it a more digestible state of being? Another form of self-defense, which would be very Capricornian, is withholding. Okay, withholding energy, withholding love, more particularly withholding approval. Okay. And this can be a defense mechanism. If someone needs your love or if someone needs your approval, you can withhold it. And that puts the other person into a place of subservience. They keep coming back to you looking for this. And your withholding of it is empowering of you. It gives you an authority. It gives you a power in the other person's life, this withholding. And what is it protecting? It's protecting the fact that the person might regard you as dispensable or could live without you or doesn't need you, or you're no longer the parent that they need the approval or the beloved that they need that love from. So withholding of love or withholding of approval can be, we often talk about it as controlling, but I suspect that on a deeper level, it is a defense mechanism. Another one is austerity or harshness in your response. Capricorn, of course, is famous for the discipline. The measured response usually was something that's more austere. And so that can also be a defense mechanism against any sort of softness or tenderness or intimacy. Maybe there was a reason for it earlier in your life, but ask yourself, Do you still need it now? Is it still something you have to be doing now? Or is it something that you're doing by rote, out of habit? Withdrawing into self. Abu Ma'ashar goes on about this quite a bit, but it's the removal of yourself from the company of others, even if you're in the company of others, okay? And that's a little bit like withholding of approval, but the withdrawing into yourself, and that's a protection of self, but it's also something that is a refusal to be moved by other people, their pleas or their friendship or their feeling for you, a refusal to be moved by others, by withdrawing into self and the walls and the door coming down. That can be a self-protective mechanism. And finally, one of the more famous of the Capricornian defense mechanism is testing. Testing someone over and over to see if their feelings are really in the right place, to see if they're really true, to see if they're really reliable. And of course, once that person passes that test, to go and come up with a new series of tests. Okay, so this is something where you're testing, or inspecting, or breaking down, or analyzing with no end to it. Testing without the answers, analyzing without the summation, investigating without the discovering. It's just the investigating, the analyzing, more particularly the testing. Is that something, maybe you did it because out of having been hurt and you're doing it to build trust, but are you building trust or are you just testing? If it's gone on for years, you're not building trust anymore. You're just testing. And so that's why I tell the story of these three soldiers. I want you to think of their stories, and I want you to think of them as standing in for your own psychological defense mechanism. How would you approach that defense mechanism? Obviously, you want to begin with, we should win. I should have won this love. I should have won this approval. I should have gotten my big break or something like that. But like these soldiers, maybe you didn't win, okay? And maybe it didn't turn out that way. Does that mean that you continue defending or fighting this battle that perhaps should have been given up years ago in your life? Shoichi married on his return to Japan in 1972 and lived quietly in the city of Nagoya. In 1974, he stood unsuccessfully for a seat at Japan's lower house. He died in 1997, sometime after being diagnosed with Parkinson's disease. It was widely believed that he had deliberately starved himself to death rather than become a burden to his wife. So that's the end of the first soldier that we meet. I tell that ending because there's this, if left unchecked, particularly when we talked about austerity and harshness of the defense mechanism, if left unchecked, a defense mechanism can choke off or starve. It can starve the psyche. So that's, again, why I encourage you to examine these in your life. In our second story, Hiru Onada became a celebrity. He's still very famous. At the airport on his return to Japan, his aged parents were thrust aside because the press wanted interviews and to take pictures, and they did. He was remarkable in his appearance. He looked and acted, and his health was that of a man who was half his age. He had lived this very stoic life on the island. He had kept his gun polished and his dagger at hand. And so remember, he was the elite intelligence officer, very Marsy. You get this idea. And he published a book of ghost-written memoirs. He tried to assimilate back into Japan in the 70s, which was a very different place than Japan in the 40s, and he couldn't do it. It just wasn't computing, and he actually went to Brazil for a while, and he did some cattle ranching. But eventually he did return to Japan, where he started a survival school, like one of those survival schools that delinquent kids go to for rehabilitation. He started one of those. He was this trendsetter in Japan. and he lived until the age of 91. So there's someone who actually comes back. He gets repatriated. He has some difficulty reassimilating, but then he eventually finds his niche and rediscovers himself. The last one to return, who was Nakamura, he came back and he went off to live with his daughter. It's very Odysseus. His son, who was an infant when he had left, was a father with 4 kids. His wife, who was devoted to him when he left, after a number of years, had been declared dead, and she remarried. And he came back, and she was like surprised to discover him. And she and her husband invited him to sort of hang out with them. And he did. And after a while, the husband, I think, renounced his vows, and his wife returned to him. And they lived together until he passed away in 1979. I tell you these stories because it's not just enough to tell your defense mechanisms after you've identified them to stand down. You have to repatriate them, redirect them in some way. So on one hand, it's like you need to identify those self-defense mechanisms that aren't working for you anymore. You have to approach them and give them understanding and give them a different place of function in your life. As you can imagine, this takes a lot of reflection and identification and getting to know these parts of yourself. There may be parts of yourself that you just really have to get rid of and just finally say, okay, this has reached its expiration date, you're gone. But they may also protect parts of yourself that have been kept in foxholes for too long and need to be released and brought back into the rest of your psyche. And these are the things that I want you to think about, beginning with this Mercury-Pluto conjunction in Capricorn and continuing to the time when Pluto moves on into the zodiac sign of Aquarius.
If you've studied astrology, you're probably familiar with aspects like trines, squares, and oppositions. But did you know that there are a lot more aspects you can read in an astrological chart? In Astrology Foundations Level 3 with Master Astrologer Rick Levine, you'll learn the magic of quintiles, septiles, and other harmonic aspects. And understanding these aspects will take your understanding of astrology way beyond the ordinary, or even what you thought was possible. Rick Levine is one of the foremost thinkers on harmonic aspects, and he's going to share his mind-blowing perspective with you in Astrology Foundations Level 3. By the end of this 4-week course, plus 2 bonus weeks of live sessions with Rick, you'll get a complete overview of harmonic aspects that will change the way you look at astrology forever. Learn more and enroll today at astrologyhub.com/foundations3. Again, that's astrologyhub.com/foundations3.